This chapter is an introduction to spline modeling in 3ds Max. A spline is just another word for a line or curve, and these fancy pendant lamps have been modeled using splines. I can select one of the lamp bodies, go over to the Modify panel so you can see its base object is a line, also known as an editable spline, and above that is a lathe or surface of revolution that is generating that surface. And just to illustrate, I can drag on this degrees spinner, click and drag, and you can see what this is doing. That's how we're able to generate that shape, is with a lathe or surface of revolution. All right, so I'm going to reset and start from scratch. Go to the File menu and choose Reset, and don't save. And yes, we really want to reset. Before we begin, as always, we should check in on our units and grid. Go to the Customize menu and choose Units Setup. And for the display unit scale, I'll choose US Standard and decimal inches. My apologies to all of our international users out there. The loft apartment was built to United States standard units, and so that's what I'm observing here. So I've got US Standard with decimal inches for the display unit scale. Go ahead and click OK. And also set up the home grid. Right-click on the 3D Snaps icon. Go over to the Home Grid tab. We'll set the grid spacing to 1 inch. Just type in a 1. Then major lines every nth grid line. If I want this to display in feet and inches, then I want a major grid line every foot or every 12 inches. I'll put in a value of 12. And for the perspective view grid extent, it's currently got a value of only 7 inches. Let's extend that out a bit to 36 inches or 3 feet. Type in a value of 36 and press Enter. And that's the grid and snap settings. We can close that dialog. One thing I do want to mention that's very important is before you start modeling something to scale, you need to make sure that you're zoomed in or out to the correct distance or size of the grid. Here in the front view, hopefully that'll be a clear illustration. I'll zoom in with the wheel, and as I do that, you can see that the grid lines automatically subdivide. And if I keep zooming in, eventually it'll stop subdividing. And I know for certain, if the grid stops subdividing, that this is the smallest possible grid unit, which is 1 inch. There are no numbers on the grid like there are in some programs. And additionally, the grid subdivides automatically as you zoom in and out. And that can be a problem. It's something about 3ds Max that's kind of good and bad at the same time. The way the grid displays in 3ds Max is both a positive and a negative. It's a positive because the grid subdivides automatically, and therefore the grid lines will never collapse into a solid mass like they do in some programs, namely Maya. But the downside of this is that sometimes you might get fooled and think that you're modeling something to the size of 1 inch, when in fact you're modeling it to the size of a foot or 12 feet. Or 144 feet. As I zoom back out with the wheel, these are inches now. As I keep going out, they're still inches. Keep going out, and boom, the grid automatically displays the major grid lines as minor. So now this is no longer 1 inch, that's actually a foot. As I keep going out, zooming out again and again, then those minor grid lines again become major grid lines. And now this distance is not 1 inch, it's not a foot, it's actually 12 feet here. So don't let that bite you, although it's almost certain that it will. The only way around this is to make sure that you've zoomed in all the way. So if I zoom in to a crazy distance here, now I know that's 1 inch. Okay, so that's all of that. Now I want to create my line at about the right height that I want it to be in the scene, which is about 6 feet above the ground in the front viewport here. So I'm going to go ahead and maximize that front viewport with Alt-W. And I know that that's 1 inch, so I'll zoom out, keep zooming out. Now that's a foot. I've got a major grid line every 12 inches. That's 1 foot there. And I can zoom out a little bit more. Now that's 2 feet, 3 feet, 4, 5, and 6 feet above the ground. And I'll create my line. So I'll zoom back in again. And that's the 6 foot mark there. And these are now in inches. And because we're going to be using a lathe or a surface of revolution, it's a good idea to snap to the grid intersections or the grid points. And that way we'll have a clean output for the lathe. I'll go ahead and enable 3D snaps. And I do want to snap only to the grid intersections or grid points. I can double check that by once again right-clicking on the 3D snaps icon. And in the grid and snap settings under snaps, grid points is the only thing that's active. Close that. Now I'm ready to create the line. In the Create panel, I want to go to the Shapes category. In the language of 3ds Max, a shape is something that has no surface. All right, so here we have geometry. Those are surfaces, and shapes are objects that don't have a surface, like a line or a rectangle. So I'll select Shapes, and we have a bunch of procedural shape primitives like a circle, arc, or star. And we also have a freeform line, also known as an editable spline. I'll click on Line to enter line creation mode. And now my cursor is snapping to grid intersections or grid points. I'll create the first point on my line by clicking on the black axis, which is the Z-axis. And it's going to be exactly centered at that location. Click once to create a point. And as I move my cursor around, we're able to snap. If we want to, we can create a curve at the same time as we create the point. And that's done by clicking and holding the mouse down. So I'll do that. Click and hold the mouse button and drag around, and we're getting a curved line. And this is known as a Bezier curve. And the location of my cursor is the tangent handle for that Bezier point. And we'll see more about this later. When I release the mouse, I've now created that second point, and now I just want to create the third point. So I'll go down here somewhere and click to create another point. And the first one and the third one, or last one, are corner points. And the middle one is a Bezier point. I'll go ahead and right-click to complete that line. And then I can right-click once again to exit line creation mode. And that's not very interesting to look at, but we will edit that up and make it really beautiful in subsequent movies. And that's how to create a line using the interactive line creation tool.